Again, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Baradwaj Rangan, Deputy Editor of The Hindu and Film Critic, and our very own Venkatesh Babu talking to us about the critic in all of us.
Hi guys, I won't blame Baradwaj. You know, critics all over the place. He probably made a beeline, who knows. Right, I think it's probably a good idea to have some learnings about the previous session. It'd be good to understand so that we can then use those learnings to deal with some of the issues. I mean, Arnab talked about, or rather I think Suresh's last question was about love. I mean, I think he asked the wrong people. He should have asked people from IIM and IITs. I mean, love is a dream. Second thing is, I think Imtiaz Ali talked about two impossible things. He talked about impossible is nothing, and he talked about just do it. That's Adidas and Nike in one slogan. So as businessmen, we get a little shocked about that. And I think we talk about binaries all the time. So when we talk about binaries, as film critic Baradwaj, I mean, if you were asked the question, can Himesh Reshammiya act? I mean, is there a binary there?
Actually, can everyone hear me?
No.
I'd like to talk about another binary that that came up in this earlier discussion when Arnab Goswami said that asked if you could not make hard films as much as soft films. This binary between what is a hard film and what is a soft film, I'm not sure I agree with that, because just because a film deals with somebody who's a bandit or somebody who's, you know, from the lower sections of society or something, does not automatically make it an important or a good film. Just like, you know, something like the Tamasha that we just saw, which is about the realization of self and things like that. I mean, that's equally important. The question is more about whether the film is impactful, whether it is deep in certain ways, whether it talks about something that we can take home. And I don't think it's necessary that we only take home political messages and other kinds of environmental messages or whatever. It's also important that we take home messages about each other, about our own selves. And I think those kinds of films are important as well. And as a matter of fact, we are making films. For instance, last year we had a film called Majhi the Mountain Man, which was about this man with this insane dream. And you know, you have had movies like Pan Singh Tomar. This year we're going to have Nagraj Manjule's Sairat, which is about, which deals with caste in society. And so the movies are being made. It's not that they're not being made, but I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the other kind of film as like a soft movie or something like that, just because it does not automatically talk about, you know, hard realities of society, which are of course important, and just that not every film has to be about that. So,
I think I want to ask a little more of a basic question. I mean, given the fact that we're living in a very democratic internet, we're talking about each person having an opinion. Do we need a critic tomorrow?
It depends on what you think a critic's function is. If you think a critic's function is to tell you whether to go and watch a film or not, then we certainly do not need a critic. And frankly, we have never needed a critic to do that job, because it's always been the fact that you know, people go watch a movie and then they spread the word and then they say, "Acha, this is a good movie, this is not a good movie," and then they go watch. So the very function of a critic, if you box it into the fact that, oh, this man is giving you this many stars and therefore we should go watch this movie, then that's a very useless thing, because everyone's doing the same job. Where I think a critic comes into play is to kind of lay out a certain experience about the film that might match with your own experience of the film, or which might not match. So I think it's more that the critic lays a ground for discussion about a film. And you know, so the critic, I mean, instead of looking a critic as somebody who ends all conversation about a film and gives the final word, I think it's fantastically useful if you look at the critic as someone who begins a conversation with a fairly involved discussion about a film, and then you take the discussion forward. Because I don't know why we have to stop the discussion after the film. We see it, we process it, and some films linger with us. And some films change when we see them for the second time, for the third time. So the film, and some films change as we age. When we watch a movie when we are 10 or 20, we might like a film. We may not like a film, but when we are 30 or 40, we might suddenly have huge experiential connects with that film. So, these things change over time, and I think it's useful to have certain critics to go back to and see what they had to say about the film, so that we kind of have some kind of, points around the movie to discuss.
Okay, in terms of movie making itself, suppose you look at, for example, this whole conference is about reimagining, is talking about how things are moving forward. In terms of movie making, can you identify some trends that you're seeing over the next couple of years based on what we have seen over the last 12, 24 months? Where do you think this is going? In terms of what kind of trends are coming out in movies, what type of movies, what can we see over the next 12 to 18 months?
I don't know if we can say trends as such, but I think one trend that has emerged recently is that it's possible to make a very intensely personal movie on a large scale, which was not always possible earlier. For instance, if you take something like Bombay Velvet, it's not a movie that worked for me personally, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination. It is not a lazy film. It is not an indifferently made film. It's a passion project, and it got made with a huge amount of money, and it got huge stars. So it was possible to make a movie like that. And I think this is going to change the way certain directors who work in the mainstream but with very personal traits are going to make movies.
I think the other aspect that you need to also consider when it comes to movies is if people don't like the movies in the first 15 minutes, it's dead.
I've
Nobody
actually
waits
seen this happen.
for building movies. When you watch a movie, if you don't like it in the first 10 movies, it's gone. You think that trend is going to continue, that if you don't get it, then people are not going to stay?
I think people are impatient, and they're becoming more impatient. So you can't help it. It's part of the noise around a film. It's not everyone is going to respond to everything the same way, and it's unfair to expect that just because you do something, everyone is going to respond to it the same way. I mean, But the thing is, I think one of the things that a critic tries to do is also instill in people the notion that films aren't always frivolous things. It's not something that you just go because you have 3 hours to kill. It's like picking up a book. Not every book has to be a thriller or some kind of romance or entertain you from the word go. Sometimes film takes some time to settle in, and especially if it's let's continue with the book analogy. Sometimes if it's new kind of writing, the first 50 pages may unsettle us because we have never seen that kind of writing before, and it might take us some time to get used to the cadences, the rhythms, the words, the plot, style, or whatever it is. So just because, so the question is, I'm not saying everyone should persevere and say, okay, I'm going to read 50 pages and only then make my decision. But I'm just saying, don't dismiss it. Because if you don't see something through to its entirety, then I don't think or let me put it this way, I don't think your commentary is valid if you don't go through that experience fully.
Yeah, but the problem is today people have no time. People were talking about the fact that younger people have very little time. They are on the internet, they see Facebook, they go ahead and make an opinion in less than 5 minutes. So the whole concept of what people expect out of entertainment is changing dramatically.
It has changed, definitely. I'm not saying that it hasn't changed, but then you cannot take every opinion seriously, right? We've just talked about how, some people, there's a lot of noise around a lot of things. There's a lot of chaos everywhere. So you cannot start taking every single conversation seriously. Yes, this kind of opinion does destroy a movie sometimes. We've seen that also happen. But, at the same time, positive word of mouth has helped films. So I think it's, sometimes you have to take the good with the bad.
So I think let's take a movie like Pico, which came last year. Pico was an unusually spiritual film. It was about letting go. Don't hold on to it tight, kind of let it go.
Yeah.
So both in terms of physically and mentally, it was about letting go. So in terms of a movie like that, which was completely unexpected, how do you necessarily see a trend like that picking up for the future? Unusual films.
I don't know if that thematically itself, it's something that's going to pick up. But what I'm talking about is in the larger sense. I think you're going to find, see, the thing is, even today, the kind of projects, I think the impact is more that a star of the magnitude of Deepika Padukone is doing a Pico. A young male star like Arjun Kapoor, instead of being macho, is playing a house husband in Ki and Ka. So those things are happening, and you know, like Ranbir Kapoor is acting in Bombay Velvet, which is hardly anyone's definition of a surefire hit. So you see that it's become a place where people can play around a bit with preconceived notions, because even even in the 10 years back, actors were asked to do certain things and they did only those things. It's only very few actors like a Kamal Hassan or an Amir Khan who developed an image of where people would say, oh, I want you to do something different in this film. Let me see what is the different thing you're going to do in this film. But otherwise, most other actors or stars, people want to see some variation of the same thing. And I think that's changing a lot now. So I think that's what, the success of Pico or even Neerja, something like that, when a movie like that succeeds and says, a Sonam Kapoor can act in a Prem Ratan Dhan Payo and in this, and the audience will accept both films, then it says something about, how the flexibility that's available right now.
Do you also see a merging of the industries of both movie making and, say, gaming? Because in gaming, for example, you have a fully immersive experience. There's a new English movie that's coming out called Henry, which is basically about a first-man perspective, which means you see the entire movie from a hero's perspective. You think that's something that's defining the future?
As far as Indian filmmaking, I think we're still a little away from that. But I think, the things surrounding a movie are still immersive, because when you're talking about, I definitely think that Indian audiences are among the most immersive audiences, most passionate audiences when it comes to movies. I've seen films in many places around the world, and you see this pin drop silence even for the blockbusters, whereas here people are very vocal about what they like or what they don't like about a film. They're really, in that way, they're very immersed in at least their experience of the film. So
can we at least tell our audience today, what are the recommended films you have, let's say, from the last 12 to 18 months that you believe sort of fit the theme of the conference and where it is?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Say 5 films. If you can pick 5 films from the last 12 to 18 months.
I would say, we were talking about this a little earlier. I would say, something like Pico, for instance. It's about, see, I think self-realization is a huge thing. And if a film can kind of take you within, can establish a familiar box or construct like a family, like, which everyone identifies with, the eccentricity of family, and give you a little something to think about within that, about how difficult it is to be with family, and yet, how we love people in the family, and yet sometimes we don't want to be with them, we hate them at some time. These are things that I think a movie like Pico leaves you thoughts with, whereas, earlier families were very, the people are very together, and they were all kind of saccharine and doing all these things, whereas now we are seeing pricklier relationships. So I think, which are slightly more real. So even within the mainstream construct, we're seeing stuff that is less about fantasy and more closer to reality. So another film that I mean, we've talked about actors who are taking up roles that they might not have been, that a similar actor might not have been able to take up a few years ago. What Varun Dhawan did that role of a husband who goes on a revenge mission in Badlapur. Again, that whole man is reimagined. He just wants nothing. He just has a wife, a kid. He has a job. That's all he wants to do. But he basically kind of, his whole personality changes over the course of the movie after this accident happens and his wife and kid die. And, he transforms into somebody who is actually worse than the villain in many ways. So I think that was a very powerful film for me last year, because it kind of questioned the whole thing of not only what is good and bad within the construct of a movie, but also the questions of hero versus villain and the overall arc of mainstream cinema.
And to kind of wrap up this discussion, the last question I want to ask you is on the trend of making a movie like Bahubali or making a movie like Bajirao Mastani. Do you think these trends will continue, or are we looking at more small-size films? Because from a profitability standpoint, you're already taking a huge risk with these big budget
I
blockbusters.
think there's always been a mix of both, and I think there will continue to be a mix of both. I don't know if that's a trend. It's just that both these movies became successes, so it seems like they are, they're kind of standouts. Because frankly, when Bajirao Mastani was released, no, I don't think anybody expected it to become a bigger hit than Dilwale in India. And similarly, when Bahubali was dubbed and released in Hindi, nobody expected it to make 100 crores. It was just a dub film that made that kind of money. So I think both these successes are going to, like what I was saying earlier about individual personal cinema being made on a large scale. I think that's these successes are going to help that.
Okay, I have a couple of questions here. It says the proliferation of critics means there's a need for a critic of critics. Do you agree? If so, should the film critics do the job as well? Who gives feedback to critics? So judging the profession itself.
I think, at least in my case, I have a blog, so people are, have been continuing discussions on my blog in terms of, they agree or disagree, or that's been happening for a long time. So I don't think a critic is a closed-off person, especially today when there are so many ways to voice your opinion. And I definitely think that, you have to call critics on things that you think that are not being said, because it's not some oracle from a mountaintop who's talking down. He's somebody like you and everyone else, except that probably he's seen a lot more films and likes films a lot more, and is probably a little more involved in the watching of a film. So I don't think that the criticism of critics is all that. I don't think that's a wrong thing at all.
And the last question to wrap up the session. Have the critics really made a difference to the kind of content being produced, and do you have any examples?
I think now that, I think it has happened, because I think the critical appreciation of films has led, I'm talking about the smaller films, I think definitely when you talk about parallel cinema, when you talk about a film like Masan today or Titli today, I think people definitely, these are the films for which reviews really, really matter, in the sense that if the reviews are good, people say, I haven't heard of the actors, I haven't heard of this director, but people seem to be saying really good things about this movie, so let me go check it out. So I think, yes, I think there are movies like that have gotten some kind of audience traction through critics, and now it's become a popular thing to, show films at festivals and get international critical reactions around a movie, and then kind of bring it back to India, so that film can ride on that kind of success as well. So I do think that the phenomenon of criticism around a movie can, or even a popular movie. The reason Bahubali it got rave reviews from critics as well as audiences. Right? It's not just that the arty films. These are movies that are helped by that as well.
Overall, I think from a movie-making standpoint, we realize that given the democracy of what's happening around, and given the democracy of how filmmaking is, what YouTube is, and how things are developing, we're going to see a lot more exciting changes happen to movie-making, filmmaking in general, and even in terms of how people perceive movies. Do you sort of agree with that?
I don't know about how people perceive films, because that's a slightly uncontrollable thing, but I do think we're going to see a lot of, and we are seeing it happen in the regional cinemas. For instance, in Tamil cinema, you see a lot of people making these ultra low budget films. Out of 10 films, maybe there's one that works. But I'm still saying that it's become possible to break through the clutter of the star system and just gather up a small crew and with a minimal budget, put together a film. And I think that's become possible. And as that increases, you're going to find people making films with phones and things like that. So I definitely do think at least the way films are made is going to change. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Baradwaj.
Thank you.
It was a great thing.